Good afternoon. Welcome to the Fibre Hub. It's really nice to have so many people in the audience listening. It's pretty cool to be speaking to people in kind of 3 dimensions. Hopefully we'll get some sort of feedback back from people. Welcome as well to everyone who's watching on the live stream. This is quite cool as well to be able to bring people who aren't able to come to the Fibre Hub into our world of HeadTalks. So let me start with a bit of a summary of what HeadTalks are for anyone who's not a Headforwards person. They've always been our internal way of sharing knowledge around in Headforwards, and we use them as a way of helping people to kind of improve and practice their presentation skills. They've always been something that's been just internal to Headforwards. If you're not there, you kind of miss out. Although we have recorded them, and then we started to publish them on YouTube so that if people wanted to, they could watch themselves back, and they could see how many times they say and whatever. But this is the first time we've started to live stream them. So we thought the live streaming was a good way of making HeadTalks a bit more open to a wider community of people, both across the industry that we're in, but also to help bring in some of our our remote staff as we start to, within Headforwards, have more remote people. Then thought this is a good way of kind of bringing everyone together. As you can imagine, we had hundreds of people who were kind of fighting over the opportunity to be the first person to live stream a HeadTalk. So I won the huge competition, and you've got me. So I'm going to talk to you for about half an hour about how companies are kind of preparing to kind of come out of the kind of change in the way we worked over the pandemic, and ultimately how that kind of ties back into delivering software. So my role at Headforwards is as an account lead. So I look after delivery for a number of our clients. So I hopefully have got some kind of view on delivery that's interesting for people. So it's clear over the kind of the COVID pandemic that we've had that some companies have really loved working remotely. Like Walmart in the US. So their CTO, Suresh Kama, said this in an interview last May. He said, as we've moved to virtual work, we haven't just coped, we've actively thrived. We are more focused on the things that have the greatest impact for our customers, associates, and the business. We are making quicker decisions and acting. Meetings are now more inclusive of people regardless of their location, their level, or other differences. We have great momentum, and we just need to figure out how to carry it forward. So I think it's fair to say that in Walmart's case, they have liked remote working. Not every company has had the same experience. The Netflix CEO, Reed Hastings, said in an interview with the Wall Street Journal that remote working was just a pure negative. So I'm guessing it's going to be a while before Netflix are remote first. And so there are obviously 2 extremes, and there's a whole raft of kind of decisions in between. If we look at a few companies that you might have heard of, and what they're thinking, what their thoughts are around where they're going back to the office. We've got on the far side, Netflix is probably the one kind of main big name that is really trying to get everyone to go back into the office like it was before COVID. And then you've got on the other end of the spectrum a whole bunch of companies that are really trying to embrace the opportunities that remote working gives us, and kind of going for definitely a very remote first way of hiring people and building teams. And then in between, you've got a bit of a mixture. So there are some companies like Spotify and Atlassian that are going for a fully flexible option. So really this means that their employees can pretty much pick how often they want to be around, where they want to work, and not necessarily geography, but definitely have location within a region. And then we've got probably the majority of companies are currently looking at some number of days a week in the office. So that seems to be quite a popular option at the moment, where it's kind of you're in the office 1 day or 2 days or 3 days a week, and the rest of the time you're at home. But I think it's clear at the moment that companies aren't really aligned on what they think the kind of best practice, the best way of working is. What's interesting though is that employees are pretty well aligned. There's a report that Accenture commissioned earlier this year, and they found that 83% of employees want some kind of remote working. They didn't say how much that is, but they definitely want some type of remote working. So really, I think, regardless of what companies would like to be, 83% is quite a big number. That's quite a lot of people that want some sort of remote working. I think there's going to be power in the people, and we will end up kind of having to have some type of remote working. So I think we're going to be doing it for a while. So we need to figure out how we're going to work in this kind of world. So the question I've got is how do we do this? Kind of what does it actually mean? If our employees are wanting to work in a kind of a more hybrid world, and we're not Netflix, where I suspect that Netflix will be able to attract people regardless of whether they make them work in the office or not. But for most companies, we're not Netflix, so we want to attract people to come and work for us. So how do we make sure that we can work in a hybrid way? So there's a guy, George Penn, who's a vice president at Gartner's HR partner area of expertise, and he said this, that success in a hybrid working environment requires employers to move beyond viewing remote or hybrid environments as temporary or short-term strategy and treat it as an opportunity. And I think it really is an opportunity. I think that while there's definitely been certain challenges that we've all had kind of moving from pretty much a fully in-office way of working to a fully remote way of working, I think it's highlighted a whole bunch of benefits that we shouldn't ignore. So, for example, diversity and inclusion might be a bit easier to make a reality within companies. I think especially for physically or visually impaired employees, they might be much more comfortable in their home environment or an environment that they're more familiar with. So that might make it a bit easier for them. I think that even if we are only coming into the office, if we're coming into the office occasionally, that will reduce our amount of commuting that people are doing, and we might be able to kind of downsize offices, or at least kind of heat them and light them differently. So that all those things together might help to reduce carbon emissions across the world. From a recruitment perspective, if we're looking at a hybrid or a more remote-friendly way of working, that opens up a huge amount larger talent pool that we can access. Now, there's obviously a downside there, that obviously it opens up a much bigger pool of potential employers for your recruitment to kind of compete against. But it definitely has a much larger pool of people that we can target. Business continuity, the way we think about protecting our businesses against kind of disasters, might become slightly easier. By having people who are able to work remotely or work out of the office, the impact if our physical building suddenly catches fire or we have a flood or something will be potentially reduced. Obviously, it's not going to help if we rely on the server room and the server room is flooded, but there's definitely some help here, and people will be more flexible and able to work in different places. That might be something that we can benefit from. And then I think that having less commuting time definitely gives people back some more time in their day. Now, how they choose to use that time is very individual, but it will enable everyone to have a bit more time to either spend working or to spend at home and have a better kind of mental health state for them. So I think these are all kind of benefits that come from opening up how we work. This guy, George Penn, also in the same interview said this. To thrive in today's new work environment, leaders must embrace open communication, collaboration and clarity around roles and goal setting to build trust. So when I read that, I think, oh, that's interesting. That sounds a lot like a whole bunch of the Agile software development principles that we work with all the time. And our Agile teams have this. They have an open communication and collaborate, and they're quite clear on goals. And I think if we are also in this kind of high-tech world of using computers all the time, we should be able to handle remote video conferencing really well. We should be able to handle the kind of behavioural changes that we need. So I think we're really well placed to be awesome at this in the kind of IT world. So before we talk about kind of the things we can do, I just wanted to touch on why I'm talking about this at all. So 2 years ago, we were all pretty good at working in the office. I think it was a pretty standard way of working. I think we probably nailed working in the office. And over the last 2 years, shaky start for some companies maybe, but we've pretty much now got to the point where working remotely is working okay for most people. So if we've got working at home working okay, and we've got working in the office working okay, hybrid is just doing a bit of both, right? So my position is that I think working fully remotely is easy. It might not have felt easy at the time, but it's relatively easy. Having a mixed environment where you've got some people in the office, some people not in the office, is kind of a worst of both worlds in a lot of cases. So the people in the office are going to be walking down the corridor and they'll bump into people and they'll have corridor conversations, which is absolutely one of the benefits we've got of working in the office. But when we don't have everyone in the office, we're going to have all those people at home who aren't in that corridor. They're going to miss out on those conversations. Video calls have worked relatively okay when everyone's been remote. They never worked very well when we were in the office and you had to dial in the one person who was at home. Humans just aren't very good at having that kind of mixed mode of having some people on a video call and some people in person, and you tend to find that conversations speak over the top of each other, and people can't get kind of a word in. And it's super easy to forget about the people who are working, kind of coming in remotely. How many times have you been on a call as a remote person? There's been an office full of people, and the room is kind of cleared out, and you're like, has the meeting finished? Okay, cool, bye. So that doesn't work very well. And physical whiteboards and virtual whiteboards, if you've got a mixture, you can't get everyone around a physical whiteboard. And while the virtual whiteboard software is pretty good, it feels a bit clunky when you're all standing in the office next to each other. And there are obviously solutions. You can spend £10,000 on the Surface Hub and it works really well, but not everyone's going to have that. And it's just more complicated individually working in multiple locations. So at home, I've got a pretty good setup. Like my computer's set up with the screens and I've got a camera. And when I start a video call, I just press the call button and everything kind of just works within reason. When I come into the office, I've got to make sure I've plugged in the right things. And then they go, oh no, actually no, the camera's not on the screen anymore. It's on my laptop and it's just a bit more of a faff. And I'm a type 1 diabetic, and usually this is all fine. In the office, I had a desk with a drawer, and in my drawer, I kept a stash of chocolate and sugary drinks and stuff, just in case I needed some glucose partway through the day. And at home, I've got an entire kitchen full of stuff, so I'm always prepared. When I come into the office, I have to kind of remember, and I've been diabetic for 30 years, so you'd think it would be pretty easy for me to remember. But I've got to kind of remember, I've got to bring stuff in, because it's always the time when the cafe's shut, or I'm in the middle of a call or a live stream presentation on YouTube that I'm going to need something, and I kind of need it around. So they're all really minor things, and individually they're not a big problem. But all added together, it just makes it just a bit more complicated for everyone to work together. So what I'm going to do, I've got 2 bits to this talk. I'm going to talk about a few different types of team setups, and I'm going to go through things to focus on in those different types of teams to kind of get them to work well. And then I've got some general tips around, regardless of the type of team you've got, what makes working in this hybrid world easier or more difficult. So I'm going to start with different types of teams. I'm going to start with probably the easiest one. I'm going to get to more complicated ones as we go on. So let's start with a regular home office split. So what this looks like is the kind of 1 day a week your team is in the office and you all come in at the same time. Or it could be 2 days or 3 days. The actual amount of time doesn't matter. What you've got here is something that is quite regular, and you've got a team that has lots of face-to-face time. So those relationships that they're building up individually around the team are going to be pretty strong because you are always reinforcing them with face-to-face time. And they'll also be pretty good at working remotely because they're doing that quite a bit during the week as well. So really, when you're thinking about kind of this type of team, when you're looking at what we use the in-person time for, really you're looking at effectiveness. So you're trying to do things like, it's much easier to have a meeting face-to-face. So let's focus on having meetings face-to-face, and then we'll do all the other work remotely. You're not really too concerned about focusing on relationships at that point because that's already working quite well. So here, you're really thinking about kind of just trying to be effective with your in-person time. Second type of team are where you've got longer, less frequent office time. So the way this might look is a team where you've got perhaps the team come in 2 or 3 days in a week, but only once a month, or 1 week every quarter, something like that. Here you've got basically a remote team. So they'll be good at doing everything remotely. They'll have remote pairing going on. They'll have remote kind of ways of working. You'll have the meetings working remotely, and that works quite well. But you're missing out on a lot of face-to-face time. So here, the focus is completely different. Instead of focusing on effectiveness, what you really want to do is focus on relationships in that time when you're in the office. So you really want, it's really important at that point to focus on getting those team, the individuals in the team to work well together and to trust each other and build that trust up. Because over time, a high trust team is going to always deliver better than a team where once a quarter you have a really awesome retro because it's in person. So here you're really focusing on being relationships rather than being effective or efficient in those in the in-person time. The third type of team is an asymmetrical team. So this is like a more complicated version of option 1, where you've got a difference in the people in the team between the amount of time they're in the office. So you might have 1 or 2 people in your team that are in the office 4 days a week, and the rest of the team only come in 1 day a week. Something like that. So you've got some sort of asymmetry with the amount of time that people are in the office. So you need to think here about effectiveness of kind of meetings, because sometimes if you've got a really complicated thing to discuss, or you want to design something where it makes sense to have everyone drawing things on a whiteboard, it makes sense to bring everyone together. Depending on whether this asymmetry is more like a option 1 or more like an option 2 team, I guess the amount of time people come together is important. But more importantly here, what you're trying to do is keep a really close eye on the relationships that exist in that team, because there's a really high risk in this type of setup where you've got 2 groups, like the them and us group. There's a really strong relationship between the people who are in the office more, and then not such a great relationship with the people who aren't in the office as much. So that's the main thing to be kind of paying attention for here. And you've got a bit of a balancing act. Do we spend the in-person time on building relationships, making sure that bit works well, or on having a really high fidelity meeting type situation. So be aware of that kind of location split with that one. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is an asynchronous team. So this is not a new concept. This happened before. This is where you've got a team that is split across two generally different geographical locations. And the reason I'm bringing it up in this talk is because I think it's more likely that this will happen more now. If we've got companies which are allowing people to work more flexibly and in different kind of more remote ways, then discounting kind of tax and payment challenges you might have working in different countries, there's nothing really stopping me working at my house here in Cornwall or a house if I had one in, I don't know, Barbados. It doesn't really matter. So I think it will happen more. So the thing you've got to kind of watch out for here is you've got a team that generally never really meets up. So they're going to meet up much less frequently than any other team generally. And it's likely you might have some sort of cultural diversity between these different groups as well if they're in different countries. So that makes communication and relationship building between those teams much more difficult. So physically meeting up, this is basically a more difficult version of the second option. So focus on relationships as you're in any in-person time that you have. But you're going to have a lot less of it, so make sure you really use it well. And make sure you at least meet up once a year, and really at least twice a year is probably a good kind of standard to get to. But also think about writing stuff down and actually make use of the fact that you are spread across potentially different time zones. So when I say write stuff down, I'm thinking more like a wiki than Word. Like write things down pretty informally, but just make sure you've got a copy of them, because then you can start to get some really good benefits here from people being able to have a meeting that isn't virtual or in person. It's something that's happens distributed over time, and people can comment on words, and they can change words, they can write things down, and that gives you a really strong advantage if you've got this set up. So I don't know what that icon means. It was, I think about kind of people. So that's the kind of what I think are the four main kind of types of team that you're gonna come about, and how to think about them when you're thinking about that in-person time. So let's start talking a bit more about some general tips for delivery success. So tips for things to think about that help your remote or virtual teams work kind of better. Okay, I think I've got 5. So I'm going to start with turn on your camera. So I still find it amazing that I've put this up, but I still, even after 2 years of working remotely, there's still quite a lot of meetings I am part of where people don't have their camera on. And I don't mean that occasionally they have their camera off. I mean, they never have their camera on. And I highlight it because it's such an important way of helping to build relationships and communicate with people. There's a researcher on body language called Albert Mehrabian in the 60s. He did two different papers about how humans communicate with each other. And they were slightly different focus. One of them said that 60% of communication was kind of nothing to do with your face. And the other one said that 55% was nothing to do with any of the kind of, it was all, what's the word? Hang on, non-verbal. And if you take away people's face, then you're only relying on the words that they are saying and the kind of, I guess, intonation of how they're saying them. And you miss out on a lot of people's intent from doing that. So you can misunderstand people very easily. And also, people don't really believe that you're paying attention if they can't see you, or maybe it's just me. I'm always a bit suspicious of the people who haven't got their camera on, the little icon that goes around. I feel like they're walking around their house. But being able to see people is so important to how you build a good relationship with them, that when you're having this team that is split and you don't see everyone all the time, having a camera on is a really easy fix for that. And I get that some people don't like it all the time, it's a bit tiring, but put it on some of the time and then switch it off if you're kind of bored of seeing a reflection of yourself in the camera all the time. And also, we've got into this kind of habit of having a Zoom background on a lot, which is really clever, and it's pretty cool to not see people wandering around in the background of people's calls. But sometimes, if we're trying to build trust within teams and discussions, it's sometimes nice, it's helpful to see a bit of kind of where people are. So not everyone is sitting in a weird Microsoft Teams classroom kind of background. It's nice to see that they're in the lounge or in their kitchen or in their office or wherever. And I think all these people walking around in the background are really distracting for you as someone on a call. So being able to see that as someone who's watching is helpful, that you can see that someone's being distracted and you can temper how you behave. So you don't need to do it all the time. I'm quite happy with people switching their backgrounds on, but just think about it occasionally, especially in really small meetings or one-to-one meetings. Like sometimes just let people see where the magic is happening, so to speak. So anyway, that's my rant about cameras. So cameras are good. The other one is, it's not just about delivery. It's really easy to get focused in on delivery. And working remotely kind of exacerbates this, because it's, you're not doing all the other things, so really the only thing you're seeing is people's output. So you can focus on output too much. So as a leader of a team, you need to be thinking about team dynamics. And you need to be thinking about all the time that you are in the office, or let's not say in the office because it doesn't matter where you are, in person, making sure you're using that for something. And I think that eating is a really important thing. There's the head of the University of Oxford's one of their psychology departments wrote a paper where they were looking at the effect of people eating together on their kind of social network. They found that people, when they ate with other people, they had a much broader social network of people that they could rely on to help them, and they were generally happier. I haven't read it all, so I'm not quite sure how they define happy, but they were happier people. So I think if that works generally, then within your team, that should also work. So I think use the in-person time, think about having lunch with people, think about having a drink after work, think about just going out and having a walk, perhaps have a meeting where you're walking around, or think about, as a team, perhaps doing, having a day when you all get together and, I don't know, do some sort of charitable thing. Right? Go and plant some trees somewhere outside or something that gets the team together and stops you thinking about delivering all the time, but is helping to build the team relationships and the dynamics between the team, because you're going to get better results that way. Start thinking about remote first. So here this is saying, when you're in person, I want teams and individuals to be making full use of their time being together. So grab corridor conversations and wander over to someone's desk when they're there and kind of pick their brains about something. And you don't have to set up a really formal meeting to do it. So that's great. Make sure you're doing all those things. But also make sure that you're also cycling back and making sure that all the people who weren't in the office at the time are included. And this brings us back to a lot of the things that we've been doing already. So keep track of decisions and write them down somewhere, have dashboards that are around. Obviously we're not going to have dashboards anymore that are on a TV screen in the office. It doesn't really make quite so much sense when people are in different places. So let's keep the remote things we're having where we had electronic dashboards you could see on a website, but talk about them in meetings when you are with the teams. Like low fidelity things, like if you've been in a meeting and you've drawn some random scribble on a whiteboard that at the moment seemed like it made sense, take a photo and send it out to everyone in the team so they can see that that's happening, and then they'll have questions and you can kind of drive that conversation back and forward. But they start to feel like everyone is included in all the conversations, and it's not just the people who are in the office. You don't want, if we're going to have hybrid working well, you don't want people to feel like they're kind of a bit of a problem if they aren't in the office. Like only good stuff happens when you're in the office. You want everyone to feel like it's overall you can work wherever, and you can really do believe that you can work wherever. And we've been doing a lot of this stuff. Like a load of these things are things that we've been doing over the last 2 years to make remote working work well. I guess what I'm saying is, don't throw all of that good stuff away when we start going to the office, but equally don't make coming into an office totally pointless because you then just carry on working remotely with everyone. If you're going to do that, you may as well just be at home. If we're going to work in a hybrid world, that means we're going to have people working remotely for at least some of the time. So we should be making sure we hire, in our hiring process, we should be looking for that. We want to look for people who can work effectively remotely. Even if they don't want to do it all the time, that's fine, but look for people who are resilient to working remotely. That will make your team much stronger. And we are already kind of well placed for doing this. Kind of the remote interviewing process that we have been following over the last 2 years, if we've done any hiring, is a good starter for figuring out whether someone is going to work well remotely. Like if they can interview well over a remote kind of call, then the chances are they're going to work quite well remotely. But I think there's loads of things we could do here. I think there's lots of research that needs to happen around how do we effectively select people based on their ability to work remotely. So I haven't got any great answers for you, but I think this is something we need to think about. I would say look out for people who only really want to work remotely. It might be fine, but I think it's a bit of a danger sign if we've got people who don't really want to ever kind of work together with other people face to face. For me, that's a bit of a red flag. I think we want people who are happy working virtually, but also quite like spending time with other people and want to be together. So we just need to figure that out, what that looks like. There's a lot of things we talked about that are all about the team and getting the team to work well. And that is important. The team is really important. And from a delivery point of view, it's probably the most important kind of element that we've got. But I think that we're moving into a slightly different world of kind of how people think about working. Deloitte bring out a survey every year, the Millennial and Gen Z survey. The last one they brought out said that job loyalty in that kind of group, that cohort of employees, reached its peak in 2019. So they're predicting that from 2019 into the future, people will be generally much more transient in where they work and how quickly they move companies. I think this is a real challenge for employers. I think it's really easy now to change jobs. Like you kind of switch one computer off on a Friday, you switch a different computer on a Monday, and nothing else has changed. You're in the same room and your commute's not changed, and it just makes that kind of friction lower. And if people are also generally kind of not feeling so loyal to a company, then that exacerbates that challenge. So I think as a company, or a kind of a larger department, or any of the kind of leadership in a company, we need to be thinking about how can we really get teams to feel like they work for a company and get that buy-in. Like, make sure they feel part of the team as their family, but you want the company to feel like have some link to the company as well. And I think you do this by having more cross-team collaboration. So this might look just like demos and kind of show and tells across teams, like, hey, we've done this cool thing. Look at this. What do you think? Or it might be more formal things like kind of town hall meetings or company meetings where you kind of get everyone together. Or it might just be the development group go off-site and do something. And I think just kind of getting people out and just getting teams that don't work, people that don't work together day to day, working together a bit more is really important when we're not bringing people around all the time. I think during the whole remote working, teams, the relationship between people in a team has probably stayed quite high. Like I talk to people in my direct team every day pretty much, so I feel like I know them quite well. But I haven't talked to the people in teams that I don't interact with every day very much at all. It's been quite easy to bump into people in the office when I've gone in occasionally now, and like, oh my God, I haven't spoken to you for 2 years, because our jobs don't really overlap very much. And I think that's a risk for all the companies. So I think we need to spend a lot of time focusing in on how do we get teams to overlap a bit more. Okay, I'm going to summarise. Remember, I think hybrid working is not just working remotely with a bit of working in the office. It's a different thing, and it's going to take us time to get used to it. It took us quite a lot of time to go from working in the office to working remotely, to actually feel like it was a normal thing. So going to this working in a hybrid world is going to also take some time. As we're learning how to do that well, I think we need to focus much more on the people part and less about the delivery. Let's get the people working well together. And then once we've got that, I think the delivery will follow. There's a whole bunch of work to do around the relationships people have got. And that's really the focus. If we can get people's relationships really strong, then everything will be easy after that. But remember that the in-person time is super valuable. Like, we have a really finite amount of time that we spend in person with people. So don't kind of waste it. Like, so if you happen to be in person with someone, make sure you're trying to use that time to build some kind of strengthen those relationships. And especially people you haven't met very much over the last couple of years, really start to build those relationships. So if we can focus on all those things, I think that we will be great at this. I think it's going to be like a load of advantages, and we'll get better outcomes. I'm going to leave you with a Peter Drucker quote, because no good talk is good without a Peter Drucker quote. He said, if you want something new, you have to stop doing something old. I think this is really relevant for this. If we look back over history, the great kind of pandemics of the past have always been a trigger point for some kind of big innovation or change in working practices. If we look at the bubonic plague in the 14th century, they had a challenge that killed off a whole load of the scribes that were used to write the manuscripts for the book creation companies. So that led to the invention, or the theft, I'm not quite sure how it was, of the printing press. And we then changed completely how books were published. And that led to a huge increase in the amount of kind of written material that was out there. If we look in the flu pandemic in 1918, that was a trigger point for a complete change in how society viewed the women in work. And it was the start, along with the First World War, of the start of women's equality throughout the early 1900s. I don't know whether in a decade we're going to look back at the great pandemic of 2020 and see that it was the trigger point for a fundamental shift in ways of working around big companies, or whether we'll look back and think it was all just a bit of a disaster where we kind of started letting everyone work from wherever they liked and nothing got done. We don't know that. What I do know is that lots of employees want us to try it. They've seen some benefits of working like this and they want us to give it a go. And I think that if we are going to have this work well, we have to go all in and try it properly. And I think in order for us to do that, we need to stop thinking about in-person work or remote work and start thinking about a more flexible way of approaching work. So I think we need to stop doing in-person or remote and start doing hybrid working. Thank you very much. I've got some time for questions. I think that indispensable tools are clearly going to be your Zooms and your Teams and kind of things like that. I think you've got to be able to kind of speak to people and see them. I think there's been a kind of a big rise of virtual whiteboarding things. I think that's a really interesting area. Things like Miro as a whiteboarding tool is really clever, and it's quite cool watching lots of people adding stuff all at the same time. But I think we're going to have to get a lot better at working out how to use it because it's quite confusing some of the time. But I think all of those things that get people kind of together are pretty indispensable. I think they're the two things that I use all the time. I think that we should, wherever we can, let teams have the empowerment to decide what works best for them. I think there's lots of logistics that fall into that might mean that we can't give people full empowerment. Like if you've got physical limitations on the amount of space, you don't really want everyone to turn up at the same time. So we've got this in this building. The floor, which is Headforwards uses, it'd actually be a real squeeze if all of Headforwards turned up at the same time to the office. So I think wherever we can allow teams to do whatever works for them, because ultimately they're the people who are mostly affected by it. But then if there are external constraints, we might need to bring something in. I think there's lots of companies that are trying to do everyone's in on a Wednesday and then you need to pick one other day of the week, but you can pick whatever day. I think could be an all right compromise. So I think, yeah, let people decide themselves if they can. I think that productivity is really hard to measure. I think lots of people have said that lots of people have said it hasn't dipped. Lots of people have said it's got better. Some people have said it's got worse. I think the actual output that teams are producing, I don't think there's a lot of evidence that says it's dropped loads. I think what has maybe dropped across the industry is kind of innovation. I'm not quite sure how we quantify that, but I think I think teams, in my experience, the teams have been producing stuff quite well, but we haven't been doing as good a job of sharing knowledge and kind of bouncing ideas around that we were doing before. So I think productivity, probably not, but I think there's probably a risk for companies longer term that we need to figure out how we're going to resolve, because we don't want that to be like that forever. Companies and individuals are waiting to see what normal looks like. So we went into working remotely as a temporary thing. And that temporary thing happens to have gone on for like almost 2 years. So it's not really been that temporary. But I think we've always been kind of going at it with the mindset of, well, it'll be all right. Well, this temporary thing will stop and then we'll just go back to normal. So let's not try and we don't need to worry about fixing those things now because productivity is okay, and we'll pick up all the other stuff when we're back to normal. I think where the conversation is going now is actually, is the normal going to be, we still have to do a lot of this remote working, and therefore we need to come up with a long-term plan for the corridor conversations like you were talking about. Because I'm sure there are technical solutions we can come up with that don't feel too kind of formalised and just a bit clunky. Part of the beauty of a corridor conversation is it's quite spontaneous. So I think those things will happen, and there is definitely research going into how we're going to do that. But I think it's only really recently starting, because now it's becoming clear that as an entire industry, the future probably isn't going to be back to being in the office all the time. The future is probably going to be some mixture of something in between, and I think that mixture will be different for different companies. But I think there's a lot of work to do in the world of how do we pick up all of those things that just happen in like almost at random in the companies. This is from the marketing forum. Our members find creative thinking and collaboration is harder remotely. Any tips on how to do this? A nice easy question. I think that creative thinking and collaboration is always going to be harder when people are in different, are not all co-located, because the bouncing ideas off each other is much easier to do when you can kind of speak over each other and kind of scribble over something else somebody else has done. I think the tooling to allow us to do that is getting slightly better. I think the whiteboarding tooling like Miro is actually pretty good now at being able to look at somebody's idea they've written and scribble over it and come up with your own one. And I think that if everyone is remote, having we're quite polite about kind of talking around each other, so I think that could work. But I think if there's lots of work to do that involves lots of collaboration and lots of creative work, then maybe that is a time for focusing on doing some of that, like the really important stuff when it's a good excuse for getting together, and then you build on top of that. I think if you've got a team that's done that a lot, they can keep doing some of it remotely, and that's that's easier to maintain. But then kind of getting people together to do the big stuff in person is kind of the way to go. I think if I move it back to a delivery software-y type example, I think the kickoff of a project, software development project, where you're trying to work out what the architecture's like and kind of throw ideas around, I think that's a good example of when you might want to focus, if you can, on getting the team together to do that bit, and then you kind of go off and you do the detailed part that is kind of follow up. So I think there's probably a mixture there, and that's the beauty of the hybrid way of working, I think, rather than just remote. I hope that answers your question. It's really weird answering a question like that. I'm looking back for the response on a bit of paper. But anyone else with any questions? Cool. All right. Thank you very much.